So what we see then is in these formative years of the Islamic faith, you get this kind of constant sense of conflict and competition that's kind of built into the warp and woof of the Islamic faith. And so in one sense, as James Sire points out, in one sense, Islam defined itself not primarily, not exclusively internally, but they defined themselves in part in response to the opposition. So in some sense, Islam was defined externally by how it was responding to and how it was reacting to the world around it. Hello. Welcome to this class of Persuasive Faith. I'm Rick Harvey, the teacher here in our local church. In this series of lessons, we are exploring the credibility of the Christian faith. If you find this lesson helpful, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you want to make sure you see future lessons, be sure to subscribe. If you would like a copy of the slide notes from this class, there's a link in the description below. Now, today's class. So we are on our discussion of worldviews, and last week we talked about just the general category of theism, and then we talked about deism. And today I want to begin a two-part study of Islam particularly. A couple reasons for that. One is obviously in recent decades we in the West are just having more and more interfacing with Muslims. As you mentioned, you've got Muslim neighbors, and so we have just much more contact with Muslims, and so we need to be able to understand how to relate to them and how to communicate with them and share with them and that sort of thing. The other reason that I want to take a couple weeks on Islam is because there's a lot of misunderstanding about Muslims, about the Islamic faith, particularly here in the West, because we've not had exposure to it, and we think differently in some significant areas, and so oftentimes it's very difficult for us to understand. So I want to take some time to really explore that. I have the same first three books there are the same ones that I've been listing the last couple weeks, but then also if you really want to go more in depth on the Islamic faith, there's a series of 7 lectures by Nabil Qureshi. Nabil was a Muslim a young fellow who came to Christ and actually served for several years in Christian apologetics, particularly working in the field with Muslims. He actually passed away here a couple of years ago, died actually quite young. But he gave a series of 7 lectures on Islam at Biola, and those are available on YouTube. So if you're interested, most of them, they're about 45 minutes to an hour long each, and they're just tremendously helpful. So I talked about the fact that it's difficult for us to grasp sometimes some different aspects of Islam. And to be able to relate to it and understand it. And one of the reasons is Islam is very complex to us, particularly for those of us in the West who aren't accustomed to thinking this way as we look at it. And one of the things that leads to this kind of difficulty for us in understanding Islam is that when we think of Christianity, we think of Christianity Christianity as a community of faith or as a religious community. All right, and we typically in the West we see a distinction between the religious community of Christianity and Christians and the culture and the government and the structure of society around us. whereas in Islam, those things are more intertwined. So it is not exclusively a religious community. It's also a social and political community. And Islam is very closely tied in with the culture. We'll talk a little bit next week about how that impacts how we communicate to them and some of the obstacles that they face when they're coming to Christ. And then also, in addition to just that different dimension of the way Muslims think about their relationship to the world around them, is the fact that there are a number of things which, at least to us as outsiders and as Westerners, look like some significant kind of irreconcilable contradictions, particularly in their primary scriptures. So particularly in the Quran and then in the Hadith. They're just things that to us appear to be contradictions, and they're very hard for us to understand. And then, of course, you just have the fact that within Islam, just like within Christianity, you have a tremendous degree of diversity. So I have this chart here just to kind of give you an idea. You know, if you're talking to a Muslim, where do they fit in this chart, right? So most of us are familiar with the Sunni and the Shia divisions, the two major divisions within Islam, but you see there's a couple more, and then there's subdivisions within each of those, and we look at that, and that looks like that kind of looks like a little bit of an overwhelming chart. But just imagine what it would look like to a Muslim if you showed him a chart like this of Christianity, right? It would look very much the same, if not even more complex. So sometimes it makes it difficult for us to understand Islam, because what we're hearing may be coming from any different source within this variety, which again brings out the point that I've mentioned before, I'll probably mention again today, how important it is when we're talking to a Muslim to ask questions and to listen to them. We're going to spend a couple lessons here on Islam, but we're just going to be skimming the surface. We're just going to be covering Islam in a lot of generalities. So what that means is, when I say Islam says something or believes something, it's very likely that you may encounter somebody who doesn't think quite that way. So it's very important that we listen to people, that we ask questions as we're trying to relate to them and share with them. So several terms we need to be familiar with. Of course, Islam. The term Islam is a reference to the religion, all right? And the term Islam means submission, all right? And you'll see why this becomes very important. So, for example, to us as Christians, the fact that we are called Christians is significant to us, right? Because of what it means. We are Christ ones, okay? So in many ways, for the Muslim, the fact that his religion is called Islam means submission, and the word Muslim, which refers to the adherent, refers to one who submits. That's very significant to them. It represents kind of the basic mindset of the Muslim. And then another term that's very confusing and misleading, is frequently misused, is the term Arab or Arabic, okay? And the term Arab refers to someone who's part of a pan-ethnic group, okay? So it's a term of ethnicity, it's not a term of religious faith or worldview, all right? So it refers to this kind of group of ethnicities that live in this area of Western Asia, Northern Africa, the Horn of Africa, that whole area, okay? So there are a number of ethnic groups that live in that area who are generally referred to as Arabs. Has absolutely nothing to do with the religion, okay? So we need to be careful that we don't confuse Arabs with Muslims, that we don't confuse Arabic with Islamic. We need to keep that very much distinct in our minds. So you can have a Muslim who is not an Arab, of course, and there are many Arabs who are not Muslim. All right. So oftentimes people just equate the term Arab or Arabic with Muslim or Islamic. And that's just an entirely wrong way to think and a wrong way to classify people. So I want us to keep that clear in our thinking. So, as I said, the term Islam, the word Islam means submission. And so this whole idea of authority and submission to authority is really central to how a Muslim sees the world. All right? So it's a very dominant aspect of the way he thinks. So, and primarily, of course, the issue is submission to Allah or submission to God. Of course, Allah is simply the generic Arabic term for God. So Islam does not have names for God like we do in Christianity or in Judaism. It's just their generic term for God, and it's Allah. And of primary importance in Islam is this idea of submission to Allah. And then very closely related to that then comes the idea of submission to the Imam. Okay? And typically an Imam would be some kind of spiritual leader, frequently in a mosque, like we would think of a pastor, perhaps. They have imams as leaders of their mosque, but you can have an imam who's a leader over a broader scale. So, for example, you have imams, for example, in Iran, who are basically kind of over the whole nation and have a very strong input into the whole political operations within the culture and within the society. And then another strong emphasis is submission to parents, submission to other authorities like governing authorities and things like that. And then comes the question for the Muslim of what do we do about all these people who aren't Muslims, all these people who aren't Islamic? What do we do about them? Well, if our primary thing is the idea of the importance of everybody submitting to Allah, then what we want to do is we want to get everybody else also submitting to Allah, and we can do that one of two ways. We can convince them of the truth of Islam and get them to buy into the Islamic faith and the Islamic worldview. And if we can't get them to do that, then we can subjugate them forcefully, which of course has been characteristic of much of Islam throughout its history. So speaking of its history, of course, you're familiar with all of this. It was founded by Muhammad, who lived in the late 6th century and the early 7th century. He lived there in the Arabian Peninsula, in the city of Mecca, there on the western side of the peninsula. And in about 610, he was out in a cave there near Mecca by himself. And he had what he said was this experience of a revelation where the angel Gabriel came to him and began to speak to him and communicate to him about the things that Allah wanted him to know. And this was the beginning of the shaping of Islamic ideology and doctrine. And so then about 3 years later, and partly, as I understand it, partly at the behest of his wife, he began to communicate these ideas to others. He began to preach them and communicate them to others. And over the next several years then, he continued to do this. And one of the primary issues for Muhammad was this idea of the monotheistic God. And he found himself in direct conflict then with the dominant religion in Mecca, which was a very pagan, pantheistic religion. And so he began to encounter a lot of persecution, a lot of opposition. So eventually in 622, he fled from Mecca and went 200 miles north to Medina. He and his family and his followers, they went to Medina, and they were in Medina for about 8 years. And he became very influential. He became the predominant leader in the city of Medina. And then after 8 years, then he returned with now many more followers. He returned to Mecca, and in a military effort, he conquered Mecca and subjugated them then to the Islamic faith. So then you get this just tremendous expansion over the next 125 years or so. You just get this astonishing expansion of Islam throughout that whole region of the world. So on the map there, that red portion there, the western part of the peninsula, and a little bit over there on the eastern edge of the peninsula, all of that was the expansion of Islam during Muhammad's life. Then he died in 632, and then you begin to get the rule of the caliphs. And during the first 30 years or so after Muhammad's death, you get the expansion into that kind of gold area there. So you get expansion up into what we think of as the Middle East today, into Palestine and Syria, pressing into the Byzantine Empire up there in what's now eastern Turkey, expansion over into Persia, which is now Iran, the rest of the peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula, and over pressing close to India, and then across North Africa, conquering parts of the former Byzantine Empire in Egypt and across North Africa. And then in the following 60 or 70 years or 70 or so years, you get this expansion into these green areas that you see on the map there. So further expansion up into Afghanistan and down into northwest India, and then expanding the rest of the way across northern Africa and across the Strait of Gibraltar up into the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal and that area, and up to the southern edge of the Frankish tribes, what is France today. And then finally you get this push up into the territory of the Franks. And this is where, as far as in the West is concerned, this is where the Islamic advancement gets checked. At the Battle of Tours, Charles Martel, who is the grandfather of Emperor Charlemagne, leads his armies to stop the Islamic conquest at Tours, drives them back down into the Iberian Peninsula. And then over a period of centuries, slowly, the Muslims, they were called the Moors, were driven out of Spain and back down into North Africa. So what we see then is in these formative years of the Islamic faith, you get this kind of constant sense of conflict and competition that's kind of built into the warp and woof of the Islamic faith. And so in one sense, as James Sire points out, in one sense, Islam defined itself not primarily, not exclusively internally, but they defined themselves in part in response to the opposition. So in some sense, Islam was defined externally by how it was responding to and how it was reacting to the world around it. So that raises the question then, how does Islam view its relationship to the world? How has it viewed its relationship to the non-Islamic world throughout history, and how does it do so today? And to understand that, we have to keep in mind this idea that it was born in this context of religious rivalry. So it begins very much so right there in Mecca with this very intense controversy and conflict with the polytheism there in Mecca and in the Arabian Peninsula. But then coupled with that, you have this idea of submission, which is so prevalent within Islam. So this kind of combination of this idea of submission and the idea of conflict and competition with surrounding religions really becomes fundamental in how the Muslim views his relationship to non-Islams, and how the Muslim views his relationship to the non-Islamic world. then specifically when it comes to Judaism and Christianity, Muhammad's relationship, initially at least, with Judaism and Christianity is quite different than his relationship with the polytheistic religions there in Mecca. And it seems that Muhammad was quite influenced by both Judaism and Christianity in some, what we might think of as more positive ways, that he was more open to those ideas, because we see very clearly in the Quran, we see some of the Old Testament scriptures, particularly what he called the law, which would be, of course, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. He speaks very highly of them. He speaks of them as being credible and authoritative. He repeats many of the stories that are included in those books as part of the Quran and part of the Islamic story. And similarly with Christianity, he speaks very highly, and we'll see more about this next week. He speaks very highly of particularly the Gospels, the Gospel records from the New Testament and that sort of thing. So initially, he refers to the Jews and the Christians as people of the book. He actually enjoins Christians and Jews to obey their own scriptures. And so he looks somewhat tolerantly on Jews and Christians. That begins to change fairly quickly, however, when he goes to Medina. And when he's in Medina, he becomes very influential, he becomes very powerful, becomes one of the leaders in the city. But then a conflict develops between him and the Jews, and at one point he thought, or he believed, that the Jews were plotting against him, and so he initiated a slaughter of hundreds of Jews. And so this is where Islam begins to get this kind of very bloody history that becomes characteristics of many aspects of Islam down through its history. And it begins there in Medina with the slaughter of literally hundreds of Jews, and then of course subsequently the reconquest of Mecca. But as Islam spread out into areas of the world there, where there were a number of Jews of the diaspora, and as well as a number of Christians, the question was how are we going to absorb, how are we going to relate to these Jews and these Christians? And so Islam developed this policy of the dhimmi. So the dhimmi were people who, when the Muslims would move into a region and take over, gain control of a region, they would give the Jews and the Christian 2 options. One, they could convert to Islam. Okay? If they chose not to convert to Islam, they wouldn't be coerced at the point of a sword like others would be, like polytheists and people would be. But the second option they have would be that they would just assume what was called dhimmi status. So this is kind of like a lower class citizen, and you would have to agree to pay what was called the jizya, which was a tax that was imposed on Christians and Jews. So you could go on believing in your Christianity, you could go on practicing your faith, but you were really a lower class citizen. You didn't have all the privileges of Muslim within the society, and you had to pay this tax regularly in order to maintain this privilege of keeping your faith. So this is kind of how Islam initially adapts itself to Christianity and Judaism. But as time progresses, Islam becomes more and more antagonistic towards Jews and towards Christians. And one indication of that, for example, is in the Hadith. The Hadith are basically what we might think of as commentaries on the Quran. So after the Quran is written and Muhammad is dead, then Muhammad is no longer there to tell people how to apply the Hadith, how to apply the Quran. And so you have all these Islamic scholars then who are writing various books that make up the Hadith, which are basically commentaries on the Quran and an application of the Quran in everyday life. And one of the things that's taught in the Hadith is that when Muslims die and they face judgment, that if they're a Muslim, their sins will be removed from them and placed on Christians and Jews. Okay? And then Christians and Jews will go to hell bearing the sins of the Muslims. So this is just one thing that's reflective of this increasing antagonism that you begin to see historically by Islam towards Christians and towards Jews. Of course, things are much, much, much more complex than I'm representing them here. But I'm just trying to give you an overview. So with that kind of those kind of introductory thoughts, what I'd like to do now at this point is begin to look at Islam using James Sire's 8 questions that we've talked about before, his 8 worldview questions. And for the rest of the time we have today, I just want to talk about his first question. Of course, his first question is, what is ultimate reality? And I want to spend the rest of our time today on that question because really this really shapes everything else that we're going to experience and see with Islam. And so, of course, the first and primary answer to what is ultimate reality is Allah or God, okay? As it is in virtually all the other theistic religions, right? But what do Muslims mean, or what are they thinking of when they think of Allah? What is Allah like? And in many respects, they think of Allah in the same way that other theists like Christians and Jews would think of Allah. So He's infinite, He's personal, He's transcendent, He's also immanent, He's omniscient, He's sovereign, He's good. All those kind of things that we think of God, typically they also think of God. However, there's a caveat. As you'll see here in a little bit, we'll come back to this, is we don't really know what those words mean when they refer to God, okay? And you'll see why I say that here in a minute. But another very prominent idea within Islam about God is this idea of tawhid, okay? Which literally means God's oneness. But what's really kind of central here in this idea, what's really important to Muslims and affects so much of the way they think and so much of the way of the things they think are important, is this idea of otherness, God's otherness, okay? And we have talked about that back in our discussion of the nature of God. We talked about how in Christianity we talked about this element of aseity, God's otherness, okay? So within Christianity we have this idea to some extent, but you'll see where Islam goes with this idea of God's otherness. So Allah is unique, and when they say that God, of course we think God is unique, but when they say God is unique, they mean that there's nothing that resembles Him in any respect. Okay, so there's nothing in any way that resembles Allah in any way. Okay, so already you can see, there's a distinction between Islam and Christianity, because we talk about human beings being made, of course, in the image of God, okay? That doctrine, that idea of being in the image of God would be blasphemy in Islam, all right? Then the other thing, is, of course, is God doesn't need anything. Of course, we believe this too, that Allah doesn't need anything, but everything needs Him. Everything is dependent upon Him. That's why He's considered to be ultimate reality. So if God is so other, then one of the things that means to the Muslim is absolutely nothing can be associated with God. You can't have anything that's associated with God. And so what that means is God doesn't have any children, which means, of course, that the whole idea of the Son of God would be blasphemous to an Islam, because to say that God has a son would be to imply that there's something associated with God. So they're very offended by the Christian doctrine of Jesus being the Son of God. Secondly, they would never view God as their Father. Jesus, in fact, taught us to pray, "Our Father who art in heaven," right? To the Muslim, he would never think relationally of God like that. He doesn't think of having that kind of a father-child relationship with God, because that would be to have some kind of association with God, which is, of course, prohibited by Tawhid. So there is no relationship with Him. And to associate, as I mentioned, to associate anything with Allah is blasphemy. All right, and in Islam, that's referred to as to commit shirk. All right, which is the sin of idolatry or blasphemy. So to associate anything with God in any way would be the sin of shirk. So what this means then is that God is ultimately unknowable. So this goes back to what I talked about a minute ago, about we have these words by which we say God is infinite and He's personal and that sort of thing. But when we use those words, when we use them in reference to human beings or whatever, they have a certain meaning. But within Islam, they use those words about God, but they don't really know what they mean. All right? Because to associate a human understanding of, for example, infinity, or a human understanding of love, to associate that with God would be to commit the sin of shirk. So there's one sense in which God ultimately is unknowable, that no terms that are applied to a human being can be applied to God. But of course in the Quran we see it happen on numerous occasions. So the really kind of the official position within Quran is that, within Islam, is that when those words are used in the Quran about God, we don't really know for sure what they mean because of this whole idea of Tawhid. Another thing, of course, that is emphasized with Islam is the greatness of God, and a lot of this has to do again with this whole idea of this competition or conflict that Islam sees itself in relationship to the rest of the world, and so you get the takbir, which we're all familiar with, the phrase Allahu Akbar. Okay. Typically, when you see it translated by Westerners, they translate it as God is great, but actually the phrase means God is greater, okay? And typically, when we in the West have heard that phrase used, Allahu Akbar, where do we hear it typically used?
Terrorists.
Pardon?
Terrorists.
Okay, by terrorists, right? And so we have a very negative impression of this whole, of the takbir, of this, okay? But that really is a kind of that's not a fair way to see the term, all right? Because actually, to the Muslim, the takbir is much like our phrase, praise God, okay? So oftentimes in many encounters in life, something will happen, maybe we get a good deal at Walmart, or our child is born, or we get married, or whatever, and we say, praise God, right? And in some sense, although probably it's not an exact parallel, in some sense that's what the takbir is to the Muslim. So they will use the takbir in any number of occasions, at the birth of a child or at a wedding or whatever. We see it associated with terrorism and terrorists using it at various times, okay? But what's significant is when the Muslim's using it, when he's saying God is greater, what is that reflecting? That's reflecting this sense of competition with the world around them, right? This idea of conflict that we've talked about. So that whole idea of, in one sense, Islam defining itself externally, you see that reflected in the takbir, because they're not just simply saying God is great, they're saying God is greater. In other words, they're seeing God in competition with with other things. But we do need to realize that it is not a phrase that's just associated with Muslims doing terrible things. Although that's typically in the West when we see it, is when they do that. Then, of course, you do get, with the Islamic view of God, you do get both transcendence and immanence, all right? But, so transcendence is God's overness or His otherness or His beyondness, and His immanence, of course, is His presence or His nearness. And we have both of those dimensions, of course, within Christianity, the idea of God's transcendence and His immanence. In Islam, God's transcendence is dominant, as you've already seen, this idea of His otherness. So God's transcendence is the dominant emphasis within Islam. And the idea of His immanence really is very secondary. Again, this would be very different than within Christianity, because within Christianity, although we have a very strong emphasis on God's transcendence, we also have a very strong emphasis on His immanence, right? The indwelling of the Holy Spirit and God's nearness and God's presence and God working in the world. So we are much more sensitive to this idea of God's immanence than typically that you would see with most Muslims. And then there's the idea of Qadr, okay, which is God's power. But when they speak of God's power, they're not just thinking in terms of God's omnipotence, which is typically how we would think of it, but they're thinking of it as His omnipotence linked with His sovereignty, all right? So in Islam, God's Qadr means that God is determining everything that happens. So everything that happens in the world, to the most minuscule thing, to an insect, an ant crawling across the sidewalk, to your destiny of heaven or hell, everything is determined by God because of His power and His sovereignty. And so what this does is this builds into the Islamic worldview a certain element of fatalism. Okay, so whatever happens, it's God's will. If something good happens, something wonderful happens, it's God's will. If something terrible happens, it's God's will. There's an interesting scene in a movie where this is communicated. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Hidalgo. Are you familiar with this movie? It's the story of, and it is actually it's based on a true story, incidentally. It's the story of this American, I believe he was an Indian as I recall, or half Indian or whatever, who back in the 1800s or so, he had this horse named Hidalgo, and his very, very famous horse, was very renowned for his racing capacity and whatever. And he was challenged by some Arabs to take his horse to Saudi Arabia, I believe it was Saudi Arabia, and to engage in this grueling race across the deserts that goes on apparently every year or so there in the Arabian Peninsula. And so he goes over, he takes his horse over, and he engages in his race. It's a really interesting story. It's a fun story. There's a lot of fiction in it, but it is based on a true story. But there's one scene in the movie where he's racing, and there's a lot of unethical stuff going on in this race. And one of his competitors, he's racing, and the rider and the horse fall into a pit that has been dug there as a trap to trap other racers. And so this Arab, who happens to be a Muslim, and his horse fall into this pit, and I forget the name of Hidalgo's owner, but then he stops and he goes back to help the guy, and the guy says, "No, don't help me." He says, "It's God's will." In other words, that I die here in this pit is God's will. It's just this idea of submission to the will of God. I have no idea whether the actual event was historical or not, but I think it illustrates this idea of fatalism that you oftentimes get within Islam. And this has an impact then on the whole Islamic kind of scientific and intellectual endeavor. Okay, so this fatalism tends to have kind of a diminishing effect on Islamic intellectual and scientific advancement. And when I say that, somebody might respond and say, now wait a minute, and we have several centuries there in early Islamic history where you have this very profound philosophical and scientific and intellectual advancement that happens, some of it even exceeding what was going on in Europe at the time, okay? And so oftentimes people will extol this aspect of Islam, this tremendous intellectual activity that went on. Oftentimes they'll point to the Moors on the Iberian Peninsula during those centuries that they were there and some of the tremendous things that they did. But the fact is, you notice that all of that happens early in the Islamic conquest, in the first centuries of the Islamic conquest. And as some writers, I believe Ronald Stark points this out, and some other writers point this out, that in those areas where you see this kind of activity are areas where Islam has taken over another region, a Christian region or a Zoroastrian region or a Jewish region, and the primary impetus for that intellectual activity is coming from the Dominis. It's coming from the Christians, the Jews, the Western thinkers, and in some cases in Persia from the Zoroastrians. It's coming from them. But that as the centuries go on and the Dominis ultimately get totally absorbed into the culture and become fully Islamic, what's interesting is you see a diminishing of that intellectual activity. So now, for centuries now, virtually all the Islamic areas of the world, up until recently when they've had, again, a strong degree of Western influence, but until that happened, you have centuries of virtual intellectual stagnation and scientific stagnation. You don't have the development of any world-leading universities or educational institutions or scientific institutions in the Islamic world for many centuries. And I think that's a product of this kind of fatalistic view of God's power and God's control, and He's just in control and He's doing things and there's nothing really we can do to change that or make that better. When it comes to the question of God's love, of course they do teach that God is loving, but His love is very partial. All right, so He's very particular in who He loves. His love is very conditional. His love is very limited. So within Islam, God loves those. Islam teaches explicitly that God loves those who love Him. All right, and He hates sinners. All right. So, of course, this would be in very stark contrast to what we believe as Christians and what the Scriptures teach us about the love of God. So that's part of the answer to what is ultimate reality, is Allah. But then you get this question about the Quran, okay? And so in some sense, with at least some Muslims, the Quran is so closely associated with God, with Allah, that in one sense it itself becomes divine. Okay? So it would then become part of the answer to this question about what is ultimate reality. So the word Quran just means recitations, and the Quran is a collection of the recitations of Muhammad. So Muhammad received these revelations from Gabriel, from Allah through Gabriel. And in one case, he was actually taken to heaven, or at least he was shown the heavenly copy of Quran, and he was told to read it and to memorize it and then recite it, which is interesting because Muhammad could neither read nor write. So clearly this would have been some kind of miraculous power he received to read the Quran. And so what you get then is you get this very close association of the Quran with Allah, in part because the Quran is the Arabic versions of the Quran, the Arabic copies of the Quran that we see all over the world today, are all a copy, an exact, precise, word-for-word copy of the master copy of the Quran in heaven. So there is a copy of the Quran in heaven. It's written in Arabic. It exists in heaven, and all the current Arabic copies are an exact copy of what you see in heaven. So with the Quran, you'll never see anything like you see with the Bible. So we probably have here in our room, we have several different translations of the Bible. You don't get that with the Quran. Okay, the only official Quran is the Arabic version. They're all the same. And so if you have, as I do on my iPhone and on my computer, I have copies of the Quran in English, those really aren't the Quran. Okay, and they wouldn't really be considered as ultimate authority. If I really want to know what the Quran said, I would have to go to the Arabic. All right. So you have this copy in heaven, and it's believed to be eternal. Well, when we think about the things we talked about in our study of the nature of God and the issue of what makes God God, one of the things that makes God God is His eternality, right? And so anything else that is eternal, if there's anything exterior to God which is eternal, then God is no longer God. All right? And so there are Muslim scholars who recognize that logic and accept that logic. And so to them, the Quran is itself part of God. It is divine. All right? And then you have, of course, it's believed to be perfect. It's believed to be the unchanging Word of God, so that every single dot, every period, every word in the current Arabic copy of the Quran is exactly what was given to Muhammad. Now, in a later lesson, we'll find out there's a great deal of historical question as to that, because in fact, there was a caliph about 20 or 30 years after Muhammad died who actually went through the Islamic world and destroyed all the copies of the Quran that didn't match precisely the particular copy that he wanted to be accepted. So that leaves a great question in people's minds, does the copy that they have, does that accurately represent what Muhammad said, or was it one of these others that ended up getting destroyed? So Allah will protect the Quran so it can't be changed, it can't be corrupted in any way whatsoever. However, for those of us on the outside looking in, reading the Quran, there are a number of apparent contradictions. So if we look at the Quran and we read it, we'll see things where it looks like at one point, for example, Muhammad is said to be infallible. In another place, apparently he's not. In one place, compulsive conversion, compelling people to embrace Islam is endorsed. In another place, it seems to be rejected, and there are a number of other similar contradictions like that at least to us appear to be contradictory. And even within Islam, they appear to be contradictory and troublesome. And so you have with some Muslims, but not all, you have the doctrine of abrogation. So the idea of the doctrine of abrogation is that God revealed certain things to Muhammad early on, and then later he wanted things to be done differently, so he abrogated the earlier revelations with the latter revelations. So in the Quran, if you have a revelation that was given later that seems on the face of it to contradict an earlier revelation, you would accept the latter revelation as being the valid one by abrogation. Like I say, not all scholars accept the doctrine of abrogation, Muslim scholars, but it is one way they deal with it. And then, of course, just like with the Bible, you get a lot of various interpretations. So as you read the Hadith, or if you listen to Islamic scholars or Muslims, you'll have a great deal of difference of opinion about how to interpret various passages within the Quran. Okay, so in answering then the question, what is ultimate reality? You have this kind of duality of, well, ultimate reality is Allah, and to some degree, in the mind of the Muslim, the Quran. This should make us very sensitive when we're dealing with Muslims, how we treat the Quran. Because clearly we're in significant disagreement with the Quran at various points. But oftentimes Christians kind of take the approach, and I remember here a few years ago there was a quote, evangelical pastor down in Florida, and he made a thing of acquiring Qurans and burning them as an expression of his distaste for and his disapproval of the Quran. I have my doubts that he won any Muslims to Christ that way, right? So we have to be sensitive to how strongly they feel about these things, so that when we talk to them, even when we're disagreeing with them, we need to be careful that we're not unnecessarily offending them. And I think it is possible, certainly with many Muslims, as has been demonstrated by the conversion of many Muslims, it is possible to talk with Muslims about the Quran and point out the differences between the Quran and Scriptures and why we believe the Scriptures is true rather than the Quran. I believe it's possible to do that and still do it in a way that's sensitive and respectful. So next week we'll go on and we'll look at some of the other questions that Sire asks of a worldview. We'll look at those, and then at the end we want to take some time and ask ourselves, so how do we as a Christian respond to Islam, and how do we share with Islams, how do we communicate to Islam, what are the barriers and what are the obstacles that they face in coming to Christ? So those are some things we'll look at next week.